A little jewel among the many urban treasures in the city of Edina is the Edina Art Center. Located in a leafy city park and natural wetland area, the Art Center offers a variety of classes and events unrivaled in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. From its origin in a small country house, the Art Center has grown to include 3 painting studios, 3 pottery areas, 2 additional classrooms, and a completely equipped media services center.
Well, I'm really happy you invited me. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate that you've told people about the awards that my new book, Fallout, has won. You forgot a few, if you don't mind. I'd like to add those. All right. Well, as you may know, I've won the Minnesota Book Award for this book. I've also won the Midwest Book Award. I am on the New York Times bestseller list. I won the Pulitzer and the Nobel Prize. And then there was the time when I entered this book into the Sundance Film Festival, and I won. So thank you for bringing that up. And I'm part Norwegian. I'm quite reticent and quite shy to talk about my good points. But what? Well, yes, I have become, I guess I could say, famous and rich. In fact, I'm getting a lot of calls nationwide because of my fame. Recently, in fact, it was yesterday, I got a text from this woman named Paula Broadwell, and she's offered to write my biography. I don't know if I want to get involved with that, but she's going to call it All In Again. So I may have to ask my wife about that before I do anything. Yeah, well, that's happened. I guess that's one of the unfortunate parts about fame is I do get some stalkers. I don't know if it's the way I look or whatever it is, but I do get some stalkers. Uh-oh.
Hi. Colin!
What?
Sorry to bother you, but
Are you Paula Broadwell?
Well, I could be. Okay, no, I'm not. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lori Creever, and I am something of a stalker for this author, Colin Nelson, because I am such a big fan of his books. It's true. I want to officially welcome you to inside the author's studio here at the beautiful Edina Art Center, where we are every first Saturday of the month. Second Saturday of the month? Let me rephrase that. What I meant to say is, inside the author's studio, it's the second Saturday of every month, 10 o'clock in the morning here at the Edina Art Center. Colin, it is a pleasure to be with you again.
Well, thank you.
And in fact, I'm not really a stalker of Colin's. However, I've had the pleasure of interviewing him when he came out with his first book, and now we're going to talk about your second book, Fallout. And by the way, congratulations.
Thank you.
So you've brought back in your second book the heroine, Zara.
Zara, yes.
And how did you get inspired to come up with this character? Because, no surprise, I'm a big fan of a strong, intelligent female protagonist. How did you come up with the idea?
My first book involves an embedded terrorist, Islamic terrorist embedded in Minnesota. And my wife actually suggested, why don't you make the hero, the protagonist, a female and also make her Muslim, but a progressive, moderate Muslim, American citizen. And so the conflict between those two would not only be in the plot, in the action, but also would be in their vision of what Islam is and how they practice it. So as a matter of fact, I worked with 2 or 3 young women. For me, they were young, in their 30s. One is a very conservative, these are both women are born in the United States, both are lawyers, practicing lawyers. One completely covers, the other one does not. In fact, she dresses like you do.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to know both of those people, and I just asked them about why do you cover, why don't you cover, do you drink alcohol, why don't you drink alcohol. Got to know them and used them to create this character. What really kicked it off for me and gave me a passion to write about this was one of the women who dresses like you, dresses very Western American styles. She looks very Semitic. She's a small woman, very pretty, but she's very Semitic. She told me that she cannot go to the bathroom on airplanes. I was shocked. What do you mean? She said, well, if I go toward the back or I get up and move around, I am afraid some nut on the plane will see me and get worried and do something to me. And she said, I can never go, if I have to go, I always go to the back. I can never go toward the front, towards the cockpit. It just shocked me that an American citizen has to have that kind of fear. And so...
She sounds very observant, actually,
yes,
of these times.
Yes. So I thought, well, that would be interesting to try to explore as best I can, being a white male Christian, what it's like.
And Norwegian.
True.
Forget that.
Makes it even tougher. Well, I was out Norwegian last month with Lorna Landvik, but...
Actually, there's a lot of Norwegians who are wonderful diplomats, so,
True.
You got that going for you.
So I thought that would be interesting to explore. What is it like to be a moderate, progressive person, feminist, trying to live in America?
And just so that we don't miss this point, what Colin is trying to say is he mostly has his wife to thank.
Yes.
You also...
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you, Lori. You're welcome, Pam.
That's enough, we're done.
You also, I live here in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I'm a Minnesotan. And of course, I love the fact, and I'm sure many in our audience do as well, that you write about Minnesota.
Right.
Minnesota is your setting and your backdrop. Now, for people that are going to be watching this interview that don't know what your career has been, tell us a bit about that. You're an attorney.
I am. I've worked about over 30 some years as both as a prosecutor and a public defender in Hennepin County. And about a third of my books take place in the courtroom, and I use not only the drama of the courtroom, but more the backroom things that are going on. Because of my perspective, I can tell readers, why are lawyers doing certain things? Why are judges doing certain things? And I think that's unique because I'm in the middle of that.
Yeah.
So I use a lot of that in the book, and my protagonist is a lawyer. On the first book, she's a public defender. Second book, she's a prosecutor.
Yeah, when we pick up in the second book, of course, you have to read the first book if you haven't read it. She has had such a harrowing experience on several levels, professionally and also with her spiritual orientation, and narrowly escapes death. So then when we get reintroduced to her in the second book, is she in a firing range?
She is. She's
packing heat.
Yes. I grew up about 50 miles south of here, and there was a little creek outside of town. They set up a rod and gun club. You've heard of those, where fishermen and hunters go, and I don't know what they do there exactly, but one of the things
I can tell you what they do. They have hay bales, and they put a paper plate, right? And then that's their target.
So Zira in the second book, who is not a violent person, decides that she's going to take a course in self-defense with a pistol. And so that chapter opens up with her firing this pistol on the range, and it's quite different for her.
Right, and in this second story, following her, she's a little more reticent to diving into what is being presented to her. Mm-hmm. And as you know, because we talked before our show today, I even found it very grisly what she gets involved in. But I suspect you had a real calling to weave in something of what's going on for real at the U.S.-Mexican border. Tell us about that.
Well, for years I've been fascinated with international criminal networks that traffic in all kinds of things. Usually we hear them trafficking in children, prostitution and so on. But they traffic in weapons, they traffic in drugs, they traffic in human organs, animals, rare animals, pretty much anything they can make money on. And the difficulty is that our American law enforcement groups are traditionally, the hierarchy, the pyramidal hierarchy, like the FBI, where decisions are made top down and you have to have 50 signatures to do things. These international networks instead are highly fluid. They're kind of like the internet compared to General Mills. So they will internationally hook up. There might be one person in the middle, like the hub of a wheel, but like spokes, they will hook up for different processes. If they need money, they'll go somewhere for financing. If they need thugs to get the stuff across the border, they'll go somewhere else. No one knows anyone else, for one thing, and they're very fluid. It's like trying to hold mercury, because the minute they fear they're going to be caught, it all dissolves. Mm-hmm. So that's a serious problem that I don't know that we as Americans are very capable of fighting. So the network that's at the bottom of the crime in this book is an international trafficking network.
Mm-hmm. Right, when they all come together, like you described, they don't know each other, which is an interesting dynamic as well, because then I don't want to give the story away, but then you see how really their disloyalty to one another, because they don't know each other, they're not going to necessarily see each other again, plays out as well, adds its own thing to the story. Well, in keeping with your, in my opinion, high courage level as an author, you are once again in your second novel probing some of what sadly can be a mythology around religion, and how somebody who is really got incredibly hostile intentions can hide behind a religious institution.
Absolutely. The first book, the villain is an extremist, Islamic extremist. But I remember listening to former President Bill Clinton about 2-3 years ago, he made the talk show circuit, and he was talking about his fear of some of the nut groups we have in this country that, because of the internet and chat rooms, get the impression that they're stronger than they really are. Before the internet, you had these nuts and mountaintops somewhere, but they were very isolated.
Yeah.
Now with the internet and chat rooms, they gain strength. And so Clinton was talking about this, what he called the echo chamber, how they reinforce each other. So in the second book, the villain is a Christian, but he's an extremist way off the table, and equally as dangerous as an Islamic extremist. So extremism is scary to me.
Exactly, right. He hides it really, really well. Talk to us a bit about the process of writing a novel. I think most writers that write seriously have some type of intentional habits that they form. So if somebody is watching a taping of the show and they also have a live stream to write, what is your practice?
Well, this is going to sound funny, but I think when I was a kid, I read comic books voraciously, and I watched cartoons. And one of the great parts about those is they're strong plots. The story starts, rises in suspense and climaxes, ends. Cartoons are that way. So I guess as a kid, I had this idea of plot and story and how important that is. I have to start with some idea that I'm passionate about. It's got to move me enough to keep me going through this process, which can take up to 2 years for me. So in the first book, I remember being in the public library in Hennepin County, and one of my favorite authors, was talking about the fact that smallpox had been eliminated from the world, eradicated, except there were 2 repositories left, one in Atlanta, Georgia, one in Vector, Russia. And it dawned on me, what would it take for some desperate Russian to sell a smallpox virus to terrorists? And of course, none of us have a defense to smallpox. That kernel of an idea gave me the excitement to finish the book. But I generally write a rough draft, revise it a little bit. My best critic and toughest critic, editor, is my wife. And then, thankfully, I have a group of wonderful readers, about 7 or 8, 6 or 7 friends, men and women, who read through the manuscript. We get together kind of like a focus group, and they rip it apart, which is absolutely necessary. I take their advice.
Or some people call that feedback.
Yes. And then I have to revise. It goes to editors and so on. And the process can, take anywhere from a year to 2, year and a half usually.
Well, it sounds really scary because you're putting your ideas and your imagination on the line. That's really scary for a lot of us. Do you have to push through a barrier to do that?
Yeah, you have to. That's a very good point. You have to separate your ego from it.
I mean, has anybody ever given you feedback that you just wanted to like cry? Just felt bad?
Yes.
Or is it?
Can't you see how brilliant this is?
How brilliant this is?
What is wrong with you? Oh, sometimes. But luckily, the people that critique it for me are also very kind.
Right, they're being constructive. But
Yeah.
I guess it's perhaps the polish that one would expect, just like taking sandpaper to something.
I suspect that a lot of people who are not writers or have never worked at writing assume that an author goes into a cubbyhole somewhere, comes out 2 years later, and there's this beautiful product. And it isn't. It's more like a scrapbook where you keep pasting things and eliminating things. And finally, at the end, you hope it all ties together.
Yeah. Do you know the end of the story when you start? I know sometimes I've read authors know the destination and then everything they do is to build and go towards
I've got
that.
a general idea of where I'm going with the story and what's going to happen. But in between, I'm not sure. I've tried outlining, and it just doesn't work for me. It's too restrictive, and what I find within 50 or 100 pages, I've gone off the outline anyway. So
Right. Yeah, you need some freedom amongst the boundaries. So what inspires you, whether it's a TV series or other writers, whether they're writers that are living or past?
For me, I think it comes back to what I like when I read. And I love to read suspenseful books that I can't put down, page turners. And I love those kinds of books. I also like books that teach me something. Even though it's fiction, I like to learn something and feel assured that the author knows what he or she's talking about, so that I can accept the factual material and learn something about the world. So when I write, I try to include those two things. Try to make it suspenseful, and yet, hanging under that arc of a suspenseful story are all kinds of factual things that people can learn about, that I'm curious about, and that I can teach people.
Yes. As I shared earlier, I really like your work because as somebody who lives in Minnesota, as I'm sure many of you observe and experience, so much diversity has rushed in to our communities in the last 10 or 15 years. It is dramatically different composition of people, culture, practices than we had 20, 30 years ago. And I find your stories treat those different dimensions of diversity with so much truth and respect that it helps to make these characters or people that would have this orientation very accessible. And I'm curious to know what other types of feedback have you gotten from readers of your novels?
Generally positive, I'm happy to say. I was very cautious, and I started the first book several years ago, about making the protagonist a Muslim person. There are very few fiction stories in this country that involve a Muslim. So I talked to many author friends of mine, people, my reading groups and things like that, and everyone said, go for it, do it.
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about it. So I did quite a bit of studying about Islam. I've read most of the Quran. I'm certainly not an expert at this, but learned a lot about it, was shocked at some of the things I learned, and then as I mentioned earlier, I befriended 2 or 3 people that I got to know and could use as a model for the characters. The response has been generally very good. It could be that people who hate the book just don't say anything, but it's generally been pretty good.
Yeah, and I have bought several copies of your book because I work in the corporate sphere as my day job around diversity and inclusion and work with a lot of Muslim people. And I'm so pleased to share this as a gift because it's a great story and it's treated so respectfully.
Thank you.
But I want to go back for a second. You had said there were things that you read in the Quran that were surprising to you. Surprising to you because you think, wow, this seems perfectly sane and straightforward. How come that gets lost in the shuffle? Or was there something where you thought, oh, wow, that is really, seems very fringe relative to what else you know?
My own humble yet expert opinion, no. My own humble opinion, I think it's because most Americans just don't know.
Yeah.
I was shocked because the theology of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism is so close.
Yeah.
The Virgin Mary is mentioned more often in the Quran than she is in the Bible. They believe in the Virgin Mary. And then even some of the, to become a Muslim, you have to accept their 5 pillars of wisdom. And one of the pillars is to pray 5 times a day. Now, before I understood what that was about, I thought, well, that sounds like my Catholic friends when I was growing up. They had to go to Mass. Even if they were asleep, they had to go to Mass.
Absolutely.
But in Islam, it's a way of stopping yourself 5 times a day, dropping out from the confusion of the world and thanking God for your blessings. And when I learned it that way, I thought, well, this makes perfect sense. We should all do that.
Yeah.
Give thanks at specific times during the day and remember our blessings. But I think most Americans don't understand that what the media portrays are the extremists, particularly from the Middle East. They don't look at Moroccan Muslims, Indonesian Muslims, completely different world.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Part of the story in your second novel also takes us to a spot in North America that I think many of us have some familiarity with. Are they up in the Boundary Waters, right? They're at the Canadian border. Have you spent time up there? Because it's written about with very good detail.
Thank you. I did. In fact, I had an interesting experience. Several years ago, a friend and I took our 2 boys fishing in the Boundary Waters, and we were up near Crane Lake, and you go into Canada. Well, the border runs right down the middle of several lakes, and Voyageurs National Park is there. When we were fishing out in the middle of the lake, there were a number of customs boats that came by and stopped, checked our license, looked in the boat. Every single boat was Canadian. There were none on the U.S. side. So I thought, well, unless I'm wearing a turban and a flowing white robe, I could probably get into Minnesota pretty easily. Coming from Canada across the border. So that's what happens in this book. The villain picks a very remote spot right next to Voyageurs National Park, because of course there are no home, well, there are a handful of homes, but there's nothing there. And that's where they're going to bring in weapons.
Wow. So one of these days, is Zira going to find true love? I have to ask that. As a girl.
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm working on the 3rd book. The manuscript is with the editor now, and she does get engaged to Paul.
Oh!
But.
Darn it.
We have to have conflict, don't we? This is fiction. He's Christian, she's Muslim. Paul is a character that shows up in both books. He's an FBI agent in Minneapolis. And Zira's mother is kind of old world, and she insists that Zira date a Muslim person, preferably a doctor or an engineer. And the fact that she's involved in the criminal business as a lawyer is just outrageous to her mother. I mean, she says, you'll only meet Christians and Jews there. You can't meet any Muslims being a lawyer, so become an engineer or a doctor. And she gets engaged to Paul in the third book, and that creates conflicts, again, with her family.
Time-honored conflicts.
Right.
I remember my great aunt told me that she was definitely in a mixed marriage because as a Norwegian, she had married a Swede. So there you go. We are so pleased to have audience, community members here today, and I would love to open this up for questions from any of you or remarks to our guest author, Colin Nelson. Yes.
Colin, did you visit the plant in Monticello?
Oh, okay. So someone in the audience has asked, did you visit the plant in Monticello? Because that's one of your key settings.
I didn't. In the second novel, without giving away how it ends, the villains are going to blow up some nuclear power plants. And I have several friends of mine that work for, is it Excel? Excel.
Yeah.
And when I'd call them and ask them, gee, is there anyone I could talk to? Said, yes, it's called the FBI. You cannot get any information. If you go to their website, they have this beautiful, you know what a schematic diagram is? It's drawings. And it's a beautiful schematic diagram. I think it's really a diagram of the Mall of America. It's not the Monticello power plant.
Who's the artist credited? Dr. Strangelove?
Right. I did find some information in my research about some of the technical machinery that's used in a power plant, and so I use those words to make it realistic. And then as a high school and college kid, I worked in many different factories. And so I had a sense of, kind of this industrial steel and concrete interior, and I thought, well, that's probably what it's like inside a nuclear power plant. So I could draw on my experience as a kid working in factories to get a sense of how people, what people are like who work in factories, what the feel and the smell is, and so on. But it was tough with Excel. You cannot get any information.
Oh. That is
Thankfully.
a great scene, too. I'm glad you brought that up. That would make a good scene in a movie. It's kind of like The Terminator. The original one, the first one. Truly. Excellent. Yes?
Colin, were you at all worried about becoming the next Salman Rushdie?
Oh, that's a very good question. Was Colin worried about becoming the next Salman Rushdie?
That's a good question, Steve. I'm always conscious in I don't want to offend people. I don't. It's not my personality. I don't want the book to be about hostility. But I tried to, in both books, I have tried to paint the good and the bad of Islam. And particularly in Zira, she is the progressive, moderate person who's reasonable, commonsensical. The villains are always the nutballs. Now in the second book, it's a Christian fundamentalist, extremist. I was a little worried, but I had a number of very religious Christian friends of mine come up and say, no, it didn't bother us. We understood that these were extremists.
Well, the reason I asked that is he was here in the Twin Cities recently. And he
Oh, that's right.
And he had a number of people who had come to him later and said, I finally read the book and I'm sorry because there was really nothing in the book that was offensive.
Yeah.
And so as good as your intentions are, there's that element of crazy people out there that might misinterpret something.
I have one of the people who gave me a blurb on the back cover is a lawyer friend of mine who's Muslim, born in Missouri. She read the book, loved it. And there's a reporter for the Star Tribune who's Muslim. She read the book, liked it. So before it was published, I had the first person I'm telling you about read it, and you know, if she gave me the okay, then I thought I was okay.
Well, good for you.
Excellent. Yes. Yes.
Just following up on this, shouldn't you be at least a little bit controversial as an author? I mean, I think that the boundary between controversial and offensive is sort of fluid depending on the culture that you're in. So trying to not be offensive, does that crimp your style in a sense?
Oh, this is a
Yeah,
great question.
that's a very good question.
Let me rephrase the
Right.
question so that people that will watch the recording can hear that one of the audience members is asking Colin, as long as he's trying to not be offensive, well, what about being controversial, like something, because that is what an author is often invited to do, to get interest.
I can talk more about that with this book because the villain is an extremist Christian. I grew up in an evangelical fundamentalist church. Theologically, I'm not there, but I understand it. And in this book, the villain is a fundamentalist evangelical person, except way, way off to the edge. I was a little worried about that, and I think there could be some controversial, as some people might be offended. I tried to make the character so extreme they'd understand, but that's a possibility in the second book. I have not had anyone specifically come up and say to me. Certainly controversy creates some interest, maybe even profit. It's something that
moves the discussion forward. I
Yes.
think,
yeah.
It can catalyze, yeah.
Otherwise you'll become like network TV.
Yeah.
Where everything is sort of
Mush. Yeah.
Diluted.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I'm still working on the revisions of the third book, so.
I like that. No, that is really good food for thought, that to always be challenging oneself as an author to really put something out there with some meat to generate discussion and give people something to sink their teeth into.
You know, I just had a thought, though. There are a lot of authors, particularly in the genre I write, mystery, suspense, they don't want to challenge. They don't want deep thing. They want beach reading, and that's a huge part of the genre, and that's fine. I like those books too. I just think if whatever skill I have, it also gives me an opportunity to bring up themes that I feel strongly about. The theme of tolerance, for instance, which runs through both of these books.
Yeah.
And just presenting the character of a Muslim American, I think for some people is challenging to even read it. And so.
Good point. Yes.
I was just going to talk about the
Yeah.
themes of tolerance and educating people about Islam.
Yeah,
How it's expressed through culture.
the question was about educating people about Islam and different religions to create a tolerant environment. I tried to do that, particularly in the first book. I spent a lot of time talking about Islam as I understood it. Second book, I didn't spend nearly as much time because I thought, well, people have read the first book. They don't want to reread the same stuff in the second book. And the third book, again, it's the educating that I try to do about Islam is minimal, assuming people have read the first book.
Good. Yes?
I just wanted, to your point about controversy, you started out with both books with something hugely controversial. I think it would have been your job to tamp down after that. And then I love three-dimensional characters who are flawed and don't always do the right thing and stuff, but your protagonist is conflicted. You know, she's spiritual, she's family-oriented, she's falling in love with the wrong guy. I mean, so there's that romantic conflict. So I think you start with controversy and then you have to pull back.
That's a good point.
That's very good, right. So someone in the audience is observing that your book it does hook you in because right at the beginning, it is controversial. I agree. It just, whoa, where's he going to take me? And then it feels like once you got us in the front door, then it tamps down a bit so that we can go on the story
So
and
you
have it be
can- yeah,
believable.
You can swallow it whole so you can actually turn the page. I don't think you can have it at such a high, everybody can't be creepy good on every
Yeah.
single page where they're like, what are they going to do next? And you
Yeah.
have to have those levels. But
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I was trying to present with Zira, this main character, is that, so often when we fear other people of different religions or color or whatever, it's because we don't know them. And then as we get to know them, we realize, well, there are differences, but there are an awful lot of similarities. And so that's what I tried to do in both books, is to show that she is American as any of us in the room here. Born in America, citizen, grew up, burbs. And she is very much like
Wants to be a
us.
judge.
Wants to be a judge.
Wants
She's
to be a
ambitious.
judge. Yes.
Uh-oh.
A question from the peanut gallery now. Proceed, sir, proceed.
Yeah. If I understand, so you are not into controversy. So I'm wondering, why do you write books?
Aha. If not into controversy, why does Colin write books?
Well, I think the character itself is a little controversial because there are very few, in the genre of mystery and suspense, there are very few main characters who are Muslim American. So I guess I disagree with you a little bit. I think that's controversial. Why do I write? That really is a tough question. You have to be passionate about it. I guess I've gotten to a certain point in my life, my hair has turned to platinum. Not gray, platinum. And I think any of us who have lived to a certain age, you get to a point where if you've kept your eyes and ears open, you've learned things. And so the ability or the opportunity I have to share things with people, if it's even just telling a story that entertains them, is valuable. Of course, there's the other part about why I write, and that's immortality. Those books will be around for 200 years. Maybe. You don't even have an answer to that, do you?
Just to continue so to me, when I see your books, I think they are an amazing element of this society, because they do bring understanding, they do bring the education you were talking about, and so on. They do explain, they do give the viewer food for thought, and that's to me the most important part. So, going back to you as a person, you learned a lot about Islam, you learned a lot about religion. What can you offer? What do you think should happen in our society so that, beside reading your books, what should we do so that we can end up in a tolerant society?
Oh, I love this question.
Yeah.
So someone from the audience is asking, based on what Colin has researched and studied and brought forward in his novels, what does he think we can do? Once we've read the novel, as citizens, what can we do to hopefully continuously create a more tolerant society?
Wow. I am going to run for Congress, so... No, maybe I should run for president, if I can solve that problem. Well, two things. I think it comes back to education, of educating ourselves. In my opinion, I think the media in this country is very, very skewed against Islam, generally speaking. We only hear the worst stories, the most horrible, violent stories, and there's millions, if not billions, of Muslims that are, going about their lives totally peaceful and very faithful
And
to
totally, not only
Allah.
nonviolent, but anti-violent.
Yeah, good point. But we don't understand that in America because our media doesn't give us that balanced picture. So I think one thing is to try to educate ourselves even about the religion, or work for opportunities to meet Muslim Americans as I have done, and educate yourself. The other thing, in the back of this book, I have pledged to give 5% of the sales of this book to anti-trafficking groups. Remember I told you the villainous network here is a trafficking group, and there are many organizations in the United States that raise money to fight these trafficking groups. So that's another thing. You could either contribute financially or work for groups that fight against any terrorists that are trafficking illegal things.
Yes.
I think fiction is a great vehicle for teaching people all kinds of new things who won't go to the news media because they prefer one news media over another, so they're not very tolerant of an ambiguous picture of the world, so they want to have a narrow view. And then here you're picking up, oh yeah, I got a book about terrorism, and then you're like, oh, she's a lawyer. Oh, she's, got a family. Oh my God, she, brushes her teeth like we do. So I think you can get to a level of people who normally would not use the news media to get rid of or their prejudices. It's sneaky. It's wonderful because it's entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
It's an escape, but it's a learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
I love that about fiction.
What a great observation that fiction can be such a terrific agent of shifting people's viewpoint and softening or just removing some of the stereotypical attitudes that we have in a way that I agree, it doesn't really seem like the mainstream news media is designed to provide that to us. What do you think about that?
Well, I do that purposely. Thank you. The fun part about fiction is you can create the arc of the story. It's kind of like the top of crown of a tree, and then hanging under that are all these different pieces of fruit that can be the idea of tolerance. It can be themes within the book, or for instance in this book I did a lot of research on data retrieval from cell phones, which one of the experts I talked to put it this way. He said, we're all walking around with these cell phones thinking we're fairly private. We are all walking around naked. The ability of experts to retrieve data off of our cell phones, even items that were deleted up to 2 years earlier, is scary. So I spend almost 2 chapters in here educating readers on the science and the techniques to do that, which I find spooky but fascinating, and it becomes a major clue, turns the plot point, turns the story. So I agree with you, Mickey, that the wonderful part about fiction is it's hopefully a fun story. Embedded in there, we can be kind of sneaky, taught different things. Good point.
You're kind of like Jane Austen.
Better looking.
But that, her intention was to definitely write with as much practicality as possible in an interesting story. What were the social conventions of her time? And hope that she would maybe have some immortality, and of course she does.
She does.
So, okay, I'm probably not alone in this room. I really enjoy movies. I have to ask you, is there any effort through a literary agent to have your novels brought in front of maybe a would-be movie production company? Besides the Sundance Festival, which we know, multi-award winning.
The only novel to ever win the Sundance Film Festival. I do. I have my expert advisor, matter of fact, here in the audience. I had a young man write a screenplay of the first book. So it is in a rough form, a rough draft. The difficulty for me is I still work full-time, have adult children, which are sometimes even more work than juvenile children, as you may know.
We'll cut that out so that your kids can't hear that.
And I've got to focus. I can't do everything.
Yeah.
And so at least for right now, I think the screenplay is on the first shelf next to me, but I'm focusing on writing the third novel. If I ever had the opportunity, I would love to get back into that, but my understanding is I think it's even harder to sell a screenplay than a novel. So it's a long process. We don't realize how complicated and difficult it is to get a screenplay sold.
We just need to get it into the right hands, you know, like Rita Wilson, who's married to Tom Hanks. That's
There we
My
go.
Big Fat Greek Wedding.
Yeah.
It was her. She went and saw the one-woman show just in a very humble theater, thought it was so funny that she got behind it and they produced it. It was such a successful movie. Yes?
Well, you can introduce Hafed as January's expert.
Right, we can talk about
Hey.
that. Good point.
Yes, yes. So, what are other plans that you have for writing beyond these themes that we've been talking about today? Do you have an idea file that you just think, oh, okay, when I've done my trilogy about Zira, now I'm going to start in on this other area that I have a lot of interest and passion around?
Yeah, good question. I didn't know how far I could go with Zira, this main character, but people love this character, and so I keep going with her. The third book is about a serial arsonist. And I picked that for a couple of reasons. For one thing, arson, I'm not just talking about a garage burning down, major office buildings, warehouses, things like that. Arson is one of the fastest growing crimes. It is almost impossible to solve.
Right.
So if you want to be a criminal,
Yeah.
I'd
note to
recommend.
self. Now, isn't it about like a 3% solving rate
Right.
around the U.S.? It's
Then a good
not
friend of
good.
mine, Dr. Pouchot, is a court psychologist at Hennepin County and loves my books. We got talking, and I was talking to her about personalities that would become arsonists. Well, she lit up. She said, oh, well, I've got so much material for you on sociopaths because they fit perfectly. They become very good arsonists. So Dr. Pouchot sent me about a half-inch stack of academic research on
Like
sociopaths.
reading.
Oh,
You know.
well, that got me excited. And so the book is about a serial arsonist who's a sociopath. And I know there's a lot of, Silence of the Lambs, these crazy serial killers. What I tried to do was educate the reader from a psychologist's or a psychiatrist's viewpoint, the academic, medical reasons, I think I'm right when I say medical, reasons that
What's the
motivate a sociopath.
pathology, basically,
Right, that's a
that-
better word.
yeah.
You should be a writer.
I'm thinking about it.
The pathology of why a sociopath goes into crime. Luckily, I had an uncle who was a sociopath and a
That sounds very fortunate.
con man, and luckily my wife had an uncle. So I have plenty of people that I know, knew growing up that I can use as kind of a role model. So now, beyond that, I don't know if Zira is going to keep going. We'll have to see.
Yeah, that might be more, it's easier to stomach if it's maybe destruction of property versus, people get, homicide.
Well, in the arsons, people will die. In fact, one of the places is IKEA out by the Mall of America.
Ooh.
34 people die, and it's very serious. You have to have, in mystery suspense books, you can use different crimes, but in order to raise the stakes to the appropriate level, it almost always has to be a murder involved. You could use a Ponzi scheme. That might be something to write about.
Yeah, I mean, it really is
But
interesting.
so often in murder, you need to raise the stakes high enough so that people in the story are truly concerned and threatened and whatever.
There's just so many of us that love murder mysteries. It's true. I think I heard an interview recently on the radio with Agatha Christie's grandson, perhaps, who's curated some of her letters and put those into a book. Apparently, a catalyzing event in her life was she rode the Orient Express and
Yes,
just
she
got
did.
this idea to start writing mystery novels.
Yes, she did.
Did you have something like that occur in your life or in your career as an
Yeah, a
attorney?
couple things. When I was maybe 10 years old, I grew up in southern Minnesota. I would come up to visit my grandmother, who was widowed, and she had a little bedroom off the back of her apartment. And she gave me a copy of my grandfather's, whom I'd never met. He died before I was born. He had original copy of the Sherlock Holmes book, Hound of the Baskervilles. And I read that book when I was 10 years old, was totally hooked on Sherlock Holmes, mysteries and so on. The other thing is, working all the years I have in the criminal area as a prosecutor and public defender, people always would say to me, those stories you've got, they're too real to put on reality TV. No one would believe them. So I thought, well, that might make a good book. And so, as I say, about a third or more of my books are about courtrooms. So for instance, in this book, we just assume prosecutors are all totally capable and they're the government, they've got strong resources. Very often cases fall apart. Prosecutor starts with a case, starts prosecuting it, and witnesses disappear, or they draw the wrong judge, or all kinds of different things can happen. And so that's what happens in this book to create conflict for Zira, who's a prosecutor. Is her case, high-profile case in the media that she has to win, is starting to fall apart day after day after day. How can she hold this together and get a conviction? And most people don't understand that really happens. And the scrambling that a prosecutor has to do, try to pull it together and convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, is tough.
Wow, it sounds very tough. Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I know you're a young guy, but what took you so long to get started? Right?
Thank you for that question.
Challenging Colin. What took him so long to get started writing?
Well, I'm only 35, though.
I know that, but
What's the problem?
Between reading Sherlock Holmes and starting your first book, there was a long time.
There was.
What prompted you?
Mortgage, children.
Yeah. What took me so long? I do have
to plant the seed.
I do have an answer. When I was about 35, I had written a novel. I had an agent in Manhattan. Pam and I flew out, took him to lunch. He had, an agent's main job is to try to sell your book. So I was working with a major publisher in New York at the time, and very exciting to do. It's a difficult thing to accomplish, so I was extremely excited. My mother died at a long, horrible cancer about that time, and then my wife and second child almost died in childbirth. And all of a sudden, I've got, to make some money, and this writing doesn't pay real well. So I put everything on the shelf for 20-some years. I had 2 toddlers and health problems, and everything went on the shelf for about 20 years. Unless they boomerang back yet again, we are empty nesters. And so now I had the time to, I started writing the first novel in about 2008. So.
Wonderful. One more question, yes.
No, not from this book. Oh no. Can you help me with this, Lori?
I'm right here.
Generally, I don't know why, but most people look down at a little bit at mystery and that kind of writing. When someone brought Salman Rushdie, well, Salman Rushdie is in a different league of writers. So how do you look at that? Is that something that bothers you, or do you think that you can actually convey what you need to convey through this particular genre? And that's the first part. The second part is you really like to be categorized as a mystery kind of writer, and only that.
Oh, this is good. So do you prefer being categorized as a mystery writer, and do you see that there's any downside to that maybe mystery writers aren't absolutely so highly regarded?
Didn't you hear the words? You weren't here when you heard my awards, the Nobel. Did you hear the words? Well, let me tell you a story. I read the New York Times book review almost every week. I have gotten to the point now I never buy any of the fiction they recommend. I'll buy the nonfiction. There's a dichotomy in the writing world. There are the Salman Rushdies and the Jonathan Fransons and what's his name, Junio Diaz, who we heard speak at Talking Volumes. Yeah. Some of that stuff, to me, is incomprehensible, I have to say. But there's this dichotomy, and the literature world looks at those literary people, for lack of a better word, they're the ones that get the book awards and the New York Times covers and things like that. That's great. Good for them. Then there's the rest of us that write genre fiction, which could be westerns, romance, mystery, suspense, thrillers, literary literary nonfiction, I think. You are right. I would say 20, 30 years ago, maybe more, the genre fiction was not given the respect that the so-called mainline fiction was. That is changing considerably, and actually, I'd challenge you. I think some of the best writing is in genre fiction. It used to be, if you go back to the 50s, the Mickey Spillane, what was his name, Ross MacDonald, I think, those novels are very short. It was all action and plot. Today, read somebody like Kent Kruger or Aaron Hart, or they're in the mystery genre, but their characters are extremely complex. To me, they're on the cutting edge of what's going on in fiction. And in a way, the genre fiction frees you to explore those kinds of things. Because so long as you have a few formulaic aspects to the story, a murder, a mystery, whodunit, that kind of stuff, as long as you have that to satisfy the reader's interest, you can explore all kinds of different aspects about novel writing. And I think the genre fiction is getting much more respect than it used to. At least now, there's an entire page on mystery books on the last page of the New York Times Book Review. At least it's there.
Is it better to call it a suspense thriller? Does that carry
That's
more
probably,
cachet?
Yeah, and I guess the second part of the question, do I mind that? No. You almost, for marketing purposes, it's important, unless you're a Jonathan Franzen or it's easier if you're categorized, because then readers know, oh, yeah, I know kind of what I'm going to get. I'll try it.
They know where to find you at Barnes &
Yeah.
Noble.
Yeah.
Which row to go into.
Yeah.
Well, Colin Nelson, this has been really a pleasure talking with you and being with our audience today at the Edina Arts Center. I'm Lori Creever. We've been talking with Colin Nelson about his book Fallout. His first book, which is also excellent, is called Reprisal. We're here at the Edina Arts Center for Inside the Author's Studio every second Saturday of the month. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Let me mention, in January, the second Saturday, we will have Hafed Bouassida, who will be speaking about screenplays. And you had asked about that. So that'll be very interesting, speaking about screenplays and films and his many years. About 70 years of experience, right?
Thank you for only 70.
In February, Beth Dooley will be here. She writes in the Star Tribune about cooking, and she will be here with her cookbooks and to talk about what it's like to write a cookbook. March, we have Jonathan Odell, who has written a fascinating, fabulous fiction book. And then Bonnie Blodgett's going to talk about gardening. In May, Dr. Joel Carter, who has won an award for his sculpture. In fact, one of his pieces is out by Southdale. He's got his book out in the lobby. We'll talk just about writing and sculpture. So thank you. And thank you.